the environment. And I'm really excited to welcome all of you to the second in this year's Spring 22 series of conversations hosted by our program, focusing this spring on sustainable business, responsibility, resilience, and innovation. Ben Packard, my colleague in the College of the Environment, is co-organizing this series with me, which will meet regularly on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. through May 18th, with a final speaker on Monday, May 23rd. Further information about all of that is available at the POE website. A reminder for students in this class, you can find the prompt for your reflective response in the assignment section of Canvas rather than discussions. If you can't find it, let me know. Please don't forget the Kuku tag. I want to begin with the UW Tribal Land Acknowledgement, as is common practice here at the College of the Environment. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This reminder of our historical past seems especially apt today as we discuss the shared goal of a sustainable and equitable future. My guiding principle for academic introductions has always been the more distinguished the speaker, the shorter the introduction can be. Today's introduction will be very short. Our guest is Aseem Prakash. He is the Walker Family Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington and the founder and director of the UW Center for Environmental Politics. He's the founding editor of the Cambridge University Press series of Business and Public Policy, as well as the Cambridge Elements in Organizational Response to Climate Change. His research focuses on climate governance, NGOs, and voluntary regulation. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Board of Environmental Change and Society, and an international research fellow. He's clearly cloned himself at the Center for Corporate Reputation at the University of Oxford. Among his many awards, the American Political Science Association's 2020 Eleanor Ostrom Career Achievement Award in recognition of, quote, his lifetime contribution to the study of science, technology, and environmental politics. Professor Prakash has published extensively and influentially in academic journals, and more unusually has gained a prominent voice in public venues such as Forbes and the Washington Post. We are incredibly fortunate to have him at our university, and even more fortunate to have him in person here with us today.
That was not a short.
Thank you. Thank you. So I was reflecting on your reasons for why you're here and why you're taking this class. And there are essentially three categories of reasons. So one is what I call family influence. They're the seeds of environmentalism, of protecting, honoring nature, were planted probably by your parents, your relatives, uncles, aunts. And that's important because one of the important issues that comes up is, where do environmental norms come from? We all talk about environmental norms, environmental values, and they're important, which they are, but we have to ask the prior question, where do they come from? Why do some people protect the environment, honor and cherish the environment, and others don't? So one of the explanatory factors is family. In fact, it's very interesting. If you look at political science literature on why people are Republicans or Democrats, one of the most important factors is families. If you grew up in a Republican family, you tend to become Republican and Democrat and vice versa. And that, partisanship, the training, the political training you get at the dinner table was very crucial, at least in the existing generation. I don't know what will happen in your generation as a lot of conversations move to social media and not from the dinner table. So I think family is very important. The second very interesting observation was that a lot of you want to save the earth for the future, which again is very interesting because now there is a movement that young people don't want to have children. It's called climate anxiety. They're not sure if the earth is livable and they feel very guilty that they're burdening the earth if they decide to have children. So it's very interesting that which has pros and cons. One of the cons is that when people have children, they have what you call the long shadow future. What do I mean? So when I grew up in India, and we were clearing some land, we hired some people, and it was important because it was posing a threat to the house. So we brought in this guy, and he said he'll not cut that tree. I said, why? He said, because it's a people tree, and people trees are holy. Yeah, okay. So what's happened in many cultures is that nature has been protected by moving it from the realm of secular to the sacred. What happens in a country of this kind is we make secular laws to protect nature. But there are alternative means that human beings have adopted to protect nature, and that is to put them in the category of sacred. And they're enormously effective, like deification of certain animals. Indians are very reluctant to kill a cobra because cobra is associated with Lord Shiva, with monkeys, because Lord Hanuman, and with cows, of course. Holy cow, it's that expression has the etymological roots are rooted in a cultural practice. So if you think about how human beings have destroyed environment, we had river valley civilizations, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, and so on and so forth, and they were destroyed. And I'm not saying you have to agree with Jared Diamond on everything. Jared Diamond wrote that famous books, several books, Blood, I'm forgetting the titles. But if you Google him, you'll find him. But one of the reasons why river valley civilizations were destroyed was because of deforestation. Most of the population in the world resides either in coastal areas or near rivers. I would say, I don't know the exact number, but I suspect it's about 80 to 85% is living within 100 miles of the coast or river basins. That's because these are the major arteries for transportation, therefore major arteries for commerce. That's where most of the jobs were. But before the advent of intercontinental sailing, which has been going on for a while, rivers were the important source of transportation. River valley civilizations, first massive human settlements you find, not the only, were around rivers, but they were destroyed because of deforestation. And human beings didn't learn the lesson. But, we kind of went through a second phase. And ever since human beings discovered fossil fuel as a concentrated source of energy for industrialization, we are on a completely different trajectory for the last 200 years in terms of demands on nature. So it's interesting that many of you think about the future as an important component. You also think of the present because you like the recreational opportunities. You want to have a job. And all these are extremely valid reasons of why we want to protect the environment. But what is missing from the narrative? And my job as an academic is to provoke you. I don't like making people comfortable. I think one of the problems we have in university system is we want to make all of you comfortable. I think we have to make all of you intellectually uncomfortable, to provoke questions, to create that intellectual turmoil. What are the trade-offs? What are you willing to give up? What are you willing to give up? Are you willing to incur higher taxes?
Yeah,
Are you willing to give up a car?
probably.
Are you willing to stop flying?
That harder.
No, it's perfect. Every answer is legitimate. There are no wrong and right answers.
High-speed train.
That will not happen. They tried between San Francisco and Los Angeles. After spending $50 billion, they said we can't do it. That's not happening in the US. You'll have to move somewhere else. So you're willing to give up a car. You're willing to incur higher taxes. Are you willing to penalize politicians who lower taxes on gasoline? Are you willing to vote Republican? Because Democrats are lowering gas tax now. In California, the government is handing out checks to people with cars. Say, my God, this is happening in California. $400 to people with cars. Are you willing to punish them politically?
I need to know more.
How about you? What are you willing to give up? Do you eat meat?
I don't eat meat.
Do you drive?
I do drive.
Are you willing to give up your car?
Not at the moment, no.
No, which is perfect. I can't give up my car. So we're in the same boat. Absolutely.
I don't
So-
know if I'd give up driving or flying.
How about you? What are you willing to give up?
A higher salary.
So the median salary in Seattle is now $100,000. And that can't get you a house or an apartment. So when you say higher salary, how high is high? Are you willing to go at median salary of country level?
Well, I used to want to be filthy rich, and that was my goal. But I'm willing to forego that.
So instead of filthy, just rich.
Maybe the other way around. Maybe I'm just filthy, not rich. Yeah.
So when you say you want to give up higher salary,
Because I could do anything. I could work for the oil companies and make $1 million a year. I could do that, but I'm not because it doesn't align with my values. So I give up a higher paying job if I'm working for a company that aligns with my values, one of which is sustainability.
that's a fair point. So do you drive?
I do drive. Yeah, you got me there.
No. That's not the intention. So why do you not want to work for an oil company that provides gasoline for the car you drive? Oil
Yeah,
companies are
well,
good.
Ideally, the infrastructure is so that I wouldn't have to at least drive a car that emits fossil fuels or emits carbon, whatever.
But this is the infrastructure we have. It's going to take at least a decade.
Yeah, I'm full of contradictions.
No, all of us are. It's not only you. All of us are full of contradictions. How about you, sir? What are you willing to give up?
Probably time and comfort.
Meaning what? Are you willing to? So today there's a big scandal. UCLA has advertised for an adjunct professor, and you know how much salary they're offering? 0. It's a front page on New York Times. Because UCLA thinks if people will be willing to work for free because it's so prestigious. So are you willing to work for free?
To vote for free?
To work for free?
Say,
Say any environmental organization.
yeah.
How will you support yourself?
Like potentially, what I'd like to do is have like my own type of business with the environment, but in that way, giving up my time. If that makes sense.
So the point I'm trying to make is the world is full of trade-offs. If you want to save the earth, lovely. I want to save the earth as well. But we have to ask the next question, what are we willing to give up? There is no free meal. And one of the big problems with the environmental movement is they haven't talked about trade-offs. They have talked about a win-win narrative. There are some win-wins. It's not that, it's always a win-lose. But more often than not, we need to get into a world of trade-offs. So if you want to protect the environment, we'll have to give up something else. And in our lovely state of Washington, on 2 occasions, we have voted down carbon tax. And by a very sizable margin. Very sizable margin. And this is the great state of Washington, where we have a governor who's Democrat, both the senators are Democrats. Democrats, always get 55% plus vote. And still, the carbon tax was barely able to get 43% vote. First in 2016, 2018. And you say, what's wrong? It's a beautiful place, Gary was describing. You see the beautiful trees and you see the clear cut. You say, oh my God, do we really have to do this? Is there a better way to do this? And I get the same thing. If you drive an I-5 and you are nearing Chehalis and you start seeing the clear cuts, it is horrible. It is revolting. It's the abuse you see. But then you have to say, well, somebody needs timber, right? We need to build houses, this beautiful building. We need paper. So there are trade-offs. And I think that's the core question now. That win-win narrative is false and misleading. That's why environmentalism is having a populism problem. Across the world, France, Australia, England, environmentalism on retreat. People are not willing to bear high taxes. Coal consumption is up. Carbon dioxide emissions are up. President Biden mentioned climate change only twice in his State of Union this time. Just twice. United States is saying we are going to create more LNG terminals for exports. And you say, my God, LNG terminal essentially means you have gas, but to transport that gas, you have to turn that into a liquid. That's why liquefied natural gas. And you have to create terminals. Terminals take billions of dollars, and they have a productive life of at least 40 to 50 years. So if you start building terminals now, after permitting, it will take a couple of years. They will last for 40, 50 years. This is what you call a stranded asset. And the United States is saying we are going to export gas to Europe because Europe has a gas problem. They don't want to take Russian gas. And then Europeans are crazy because Germans say they rather burn coal than to restart the nuclear plants. And you say, what's wrong with these Germans? But that's what the German public feels. They have Greens in the coalition. So the point I'm trying to make is, as we discuss corporate social responsibility, climate change, the crucial issue is trade-offs. How do we make trade-offs? Who decides? There's an issue of power. Who bears the cost? Climate change is not going to be cost-free, it will be costly. And justice demands that people who have caused the problem should not pick up the tab. Justice also demands that, ability to pay should matter in distribution of costs. But you look at the debate on net metering in California. Who has solar panels installed on rooftops? Is the rich people. And they generate electricity, they put it back in grid at the same cost at which they bought it. But then somebody has to pay for maintaining the grid. And who pays it? People who don't have solar panels. Who are they? The poor people. So the environmental community is quite divided. If we do away with net metering and say, okay, you have solar panels, lovely, but you have to pick up the tab for maintaining this grid, then solar's popularity diminishes. It is more equitable, but we are kind of decelerating solar growth. So where do we draw the line? Electric vehicles. In the United States, we sell roughly between 70 to 18 million vehicles per annum, roughly. Now there's a supply shortage, so we'll probably sell about 15, 16. And we have a stock for about vehicles on the road, about 170, 180 million. Depends how you count. But only 3 to 5% are electric or hybrids. 95% are not. And which is the biggest selling electric vehicles? Tesla. So if you want to subsidize electric vehicles, do you want to subsidize Tesla? Really? So we all say, let's do EV. Lovely. I drive a Prius Prime. I get about 30 miles a gallon, 30 miles a charge. So up and down, I live in Edmonds. We drive an electric to the extent as possible. But we should not be getting subsidies. But we get subsidies. Is it fair? Are environmentalists barking the wrong tree? Are they backing a solution which is highly inequitable, highly biased towards the rich? Or that's the first step. Because if you want to popularize the EV, you have to start with the early movers. That's how the product life cycle goes. That's what we have been taught in business schools. First, you have the early adopters. They pay a higher price. Firms invest. They expand. They have economies of scale. The prices come down. So the first movers have to be subsidized. It's a reasonable argument. It's not an unreasonable argument, but there are trade-offs. How do you go to a place like India? Most people don't have electricity. They burn cow dung or wood, which is highly polluting. So if you say you can't burn wood, you're not giving energy security. So to save the world, you're denying them the fuel for their use. And getting electricity to every household is very, very expensive. Very expensive. Yeah, people talk about microgrids and all, but that's more for talk. It's really not a scaling up measure. So where do you draw the line? Or you go to West Virginia, the second poorest state in the United States. West Virginia is kind of demonized. Joe Manchin is public enemy number 1 in Seattle, right? But you go there, it's a beautiful state. If you go there in fall, you'll fall in love with West Virginia. It's absolutely gorgeous. But then you go beyond the highways. Every highway is called Robert C. Byrd Highway because Senator Byrd was the head of the Appropriation Committee for a long time. So every highway has his name, which is fine. And you realize there's so much of poverty. Horrible. And a lot of these are mining communities. And they really don't like you people from the city because you think you're closing coal mines. They're misinformed, but there is a big pushback against these urban environmentalists because it's taken their livelihood. Go to Nevada, Thacker Pass. America wants to create a lithium mine because lithium is a very important component of batteries. We need it for EVs. Thacker Pass. And it's a big debate going on because native groups are saying that some of this land is sacred to us. You can't touch it. Some environmental groups are saying that we have some protected or endangered flora and fauna here. You can't touch it. So whose values will prevail? The native people, the environmentalists, or the climate people who want lithium? Because without lithium, we can't have EVs. The current invasion of Ukraine has raised the price of nickel by about 3 to 4 times, lithium and copper and everything. Average price of the EV has risen to something like $1,200 already because of the invasion. Because all our critical minerals we need for EVs are imported. And of course, God forbid, tomorrow there's a clash with China. And China is the biggest refiner, importer of critical minerals. They can shut down EV industry tomorrow if they want. In fact, they did that with Japan when they had a dispute over an island 2 years ago. They just stopped giving them access to what are called critical minerals. So there's a dispute with China, the way we are having a dispute with Russia, they can easily cut off supply and our solar, EV, everything will collapse. We don't have domestic capacity. So do we go for national security? Or do we hurt the sentiments of environmentalists and native people and continue mining in Thacker Pass? There are trade-offs. So one thing is, it's nice to be idealistic. It is nice to have vision. It's nice to be humans. It's nice to, think about the future. But at the same time, we have to be prepared to give up something because the world has trade-offs. And that is where the whole corporate responsibility, the whole argument, ESG, CSR, that is where it comes in. So can somebody tell me, what is a corporation? How do we define a corporation? And I'm not saying for this, this is a very fundamental question. What is a corporation? Not legally speaking, but when you say the word business, business can mean so many things. What is your understanding of a business? What's a business? Can somebody tell me, how do you define a corporation? Are non-profits corporations? Evergreen Hospital, which has kind of colonized the whole of Kirkland, that's a non-profit organization. Is that a firm? Or is it non-profit? It's a non-profit organization. In fact, most of the medical complexes across the country are owned by non-profits. Chief executives making salaries in millions of dollars. They're all non-profits. So are they firms? What exactly is a firm? Can somebody tell me? Can you define a firm? How do I differentiate a firm from a non-firm? Because if you want to talk about CSR and ESG in the context of businesses, we should first define the entity we want to govern. So what's a firm? What's your definition? What's your notion of a firm?
Firm is, I guess, like a company that expects a return, like a profit, that aims to maximize profit.
All the hospitals want to maximize profits, and they're supposed to be non-profits. So what's the disconnect here?
Yeah,
Gates Foundation wants to have the highest return on its investments. So are they a firm? Are they a non-profit? Somebody else, what exactly is a firm? And why do we have firms? Can we think of a world without firms? Or firm is the beast you hate, but you must learn to live with. What about this thing about communism? People talk about communism. Very popular in Seattle and University of Washington. So in communism, do they have firms or they don't have firms, or is firms something typical to capitalism? And or what are these isms? Do they mean anything? Can somebody tell me? Okay, so it's very interesting. If you look at the history of the firm, when was the firm, the notion of a firm? And of course, there are different kinds of firms. So when people talk about the firm, they talk about a publicly traded company, an entity that has stocks, that makes public offerings, that is listed on stock exchange. But the reality is 9 out of 10 jobs in the United States in the private sector are not in these big corporations. The small mom and pop stores, small restaurants that are not registered as corporations. They may be, limited liability companies or something of that kind. But the basic principle is when industrialization started gathering space. So first used to have this owner, technician, entrepreneur model. People would be working in the basement of their houses, living on the top floor, which still happens in a lot of countries, and selling the stuff they make or working part-time. But as technology became more sophisticated, they needed to expand the scale of operation. And they started needing technical expertise. So the owner manager had to go outside the family to recruit the labor force. And the labor force had to be specialization. It had to be specialized because they started using machinery, because they knew how to extract and how to work with fossil fuels to power the machinery. The coal. Coal was the big thing 200-300 years ago. So that is when the notion of a modern corporation arose. Corporation arose because as the scale of operation increased, the owner had to employ people outside the family, and to increase the size and the scale of operations, they had to borrow money because technology was more expensive. So they either had to take loans, which was very popular in the first phase of the industrial revolution, and eventually some kind of shares. But that raised a different set of problems. That who actually owns the company? Is it the shareholders or is it the people who manage them? This is one of the classic debates in the theory of firm. Who owns the firm? Because if we say it's the owner manager who owns the firm, then the firm should serve as per the wishes of the owner and manager. And a lot of owner managers, Koch brothers, it's a privately held company. The way they raise money is through loans. They don't believe in listing their shares. Some people don't want to let go of control. But most do. It's called leverage. So you increase the financial leverage, you kind of share ownership by floating shares, you get extra money in, and you expand the scale, you make more money, you make more profits. But the fact is, who owns the firm? So the classic view is the firm is owned by shareholders. They are the ultimate owners of the firm. That's because without their money, the firm would not exist. People contest that because if you see the historical evolution of the firm, shareholders came at a later stage and the firms were still operating. But that's the modern nature of the firm or publicly listed company. And the argument, especially amongst economists, is that the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholders' wealth, which is a very attractive statement, but it's deeply problematic to operationalize. When you say maximize the profits, you say over what period of time? 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Time scale differs. And when you say maximize shareholder wealth, are you saying they have to give higher dividends, or is it stock prices if they keep on increasing? Amazon till 2011 was not generating any profits. All the money they earned, they plowed it back, but its share prices kept on rising. Because people said, all this investment is for the future, and eventually they're going to make money, and they turned out to be right. So if the metric for understanding firm performance, share price, the question we have to ask is over what period of time? And that's a very crucial question. because the climate debate really centers about time horizon. Oil prices are high now. So should we then start investing in oil and natural gas? It makes a lot of sense. If you see S&P 500, they have 11 sectors. The best performing sector is energy sector for the last 2 years. Amazing. Very high returns. Exxon, everybody's making record profits. So if you had a 1 or 2 time horizon, I would say energy is the place. Phenomenal returns. In fact, one of the problems energy companies are facing is they're sitting on a lot of money. And shareholders are saying, you've not given us good dividends for the last several years, give us back dividends or do some share buyback or something. So a lot of oil companies are actually not investing as much of money as one would think in drilling and expansion for a very peculiar reason related to that. So that is one issue, over what time horizon. But number two, I think if you step back and say, okay, what if shareholders have different preferences? I have some activist shareholders who want the firm not to do bad things. And they're prepared to take a hit on the profits. But there are some other activists, some other shareholders who want the firm to make a lot of money. So is it simple majority rule that would prevail? And maybe so. But then do we need anything to protect the rights of minorities in shareholders? So I think these are the debates that are happening on how firms should think about climate issues, assuming there is a trade-off, assuming there is no win-win, at least not in the short run. And I think that's a very crucial issue. The same debate actually started in 1950s with something called corporate social responsibility. And the alternative narrative was the purpose of the firm is not maximizing shareholder wealth, but the purpose of the firm is to respond to the concerns of stakeholders. It's a very attractive term, stakeholders. But then you say, what exactly is meant by stakeholders? How do we know somebody has a stake? And does everybody who has a stake have equal standing? What if some stakeholders want something else and some stakeholders want something else? Think of Amazon unionization issue. If you're a labor union, you would say, oh my God, I'm so glad Amazon is having a union. But if you are an active investor, you say, oh my God, now the labor costs for Amazon are going to increase. Whose preferences would prevail and why? Do we have a moral argument? How do we attach moral weights to different preferences? Or is it only a financial weight? You get to talk only if you have shares, which is also a different kind of morality, but they're competing moral metrics. So 1950s, this movement started taking place, stakeholder, because people said this shareholder maximization is morally problematic because to build a company, you need efforts of so many different people. It's not only shareholders, it's the workers. And that has to be recognized. If you say the sole purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder wealth, then you would minimize wage and essentially exploit labor so that you can increase more profits. That is not true. That is not correct. And that should not be done. So we have to rethink the social purpose of the firm. Corporations have a social responsibility. That was the CSR movement. And it led to a very fierce debate. And one debate was, okay, as I said, how do you balance the interest of competing stakeholders? Second was, okay, is it firms that are doing very well on profits are also the ones that are more socially progressive? So if you think of globally, which countries are most advanced on climate issues? It's the rich countries. There's something called the environmental Kuznets curve. When you're very poor, per capita income is low, you do poorly on environmental issues. As you start industrializing, you start polluting. So your actually environmental state of affairs deteriorates. But at a certain point, inflection point, you become rich and you start again investing in protecting the environment because you have more money, plus people are satisfying what I call, higher needs in Maslow's hierarchy, what we call post-materialism hypothesis. And you have public demand for environmental protection. A lot of people here want environmental protection, but all of you are in developed economies. Think of yourself as a person who's fleeing Ukraine. Would you say I want to protect the environment, or you say I want to protect myself? Or if you think Russians have to be pushed back and you would use explosives that would destroy the environment, would you want to use the explosives that would hurt the environment, pollute waterways, or not? I think most Ukrainians say we want to put the Russians out. We'll take care of the environment later on. It's a different, and it's not that they're wrong or right. It's a different context. So how we prioritize environmental issues over other issues depends a lot on context, but a lot depends on wealth. And same thing people say about companies. Yeah, you can talk about CSR. You can donate money to Seattle Science Center. You can support universities. You can have charities if you're rich. Poor people don't have the resources to do social stuff. Philanthropy is a pastime of the rich, not of the poor. So if the firm has to be socially responsible, firm first has to be rich. So without shareholder paying attention to profits, you can't do CSR. And this is a debate about causality. What causes what? Does CSR cause shareholder wealth increase or vice versa? And I would say there are at least 100 studies, very sophisticated, econometrically speaking, that are debating this issue, and will continue to do so because it is a very, very difficult puzzle, and it's not easy one to crack. So that is the first debate. The second issue that arises was people stopped making a moral case for corporate social responsibility. They said, no, we want to make a political case. What do you mean by that? They said, okay, let us assume you want to do shareholder wealth maximization. Lovely. But to run the firm, you have to make sure the labor force is happy. You want to make sure that you have all the permits. You want to make sure that there's sufficient law and order. A lot of businesses are leaving Pike Place, including the Piroshki place. It was, one of the icons of, because there is no law and order. You can't maximize wealth without law and order. Similarly, if labor is always fighting with you, local communities are up in revolt, you can't maximize, you can't function. So this is what we call social license to operate. Every business firm needs licenses to operate. And you need a social license to operate. You have to be legitimate. So CSR is a tool for the firms to seek legitimacy in order to maximize shareholder wealth. But the path, the road to shareholder wealth goes through social legitimacy. And social legitimacy means you have to give some money for charity, to support local communities, to help local public goods. This buys you the social goodwill. So people said, well, how much? In countries like India now, there's a law, 2% of profits must be given to CSR. But then so many things get labeled under CSR, you say, that makes no sense. So this is where the courts have said, we will defer to the manager. We can't say, some companies have donated generously to CSR. So some shareholders brought lawsuits against them that they are not doing the fiduciary duty of delivering on shareholder wealth, of maximizing profits. And court said, no, these are the managers, we will defer to them. We can't micromanage how a company wants to spend its money. If you don't like the company, sell off your shares and move somewhere else. You have the exit option. So there's a sorting taking place, there's a sorting hypothesis that if a company is doing very well on corporate social responsibility, then it will attract shareholders that are attracted by these dimensions, because shareholders can exit at very low cost. You can buy and sell shares, which means now we have different groupings of firms. Some firms think that they need to devote certain level of resources for social license to operate, and others think the other way. And as shareholders, the ultimate owners can decide, which leaves a lot of room for managerial autonomy. As long as you are delivering decently on your share prices and there is no move to oust you in a shareholder meeting, managers have some level of autonomy on what is the level of CSR they want to do and how they construct the rate of return over what period of time, etc., etc. And sometimes they don't even have to defend it on grounds of ROR, of rate of return, or net present value, or internal rate of return. They say this is important. We have to build this hospital. It's important. And we can't monetize. This is the benefit we get, but it's important for the community. That's why the notion of a company town. If you go in the Midwest, a lot of small towns were really thriving because the company was there and the company invested in museums, they sponsored the Little League, they sponsored the playgrounds. Seattle used to be a company town of Boeing at some point in time. If you go to Seattle Science Center and others, you see Boeing everywhere. It invested a lot in Seattle. So that was their corporate social responsibility. It was a way to gain legitimacy and political influence. It's both. So the whole ESG CSR debate essentially comes out of the same thing. Very few will say climate issues are unimportant. I think now everybody says climate issues are important, including oil and gas industry, including most Republicans. So that debate is over. The debate is how to pursue them. How to make a trade-off between the present and the future. What level of resources need to be invested? And where? Some people say hydrogen is the cleanest fuel. Let's just do green hydrogen. And let's create hydrogen hubs. Some are saying no, nuclear fusion or nuclear fission. So there's a choice of technology, which is drawing a lot of debate. And obviously, the issue of how should it be funded? Is it governmental funding or is it something else? And how quickly are we going to move away from fossil fuels? But fossil fuel is just one thing. We keep on talking about oil and natural gas and all. Like in state of New York, there's a huge debate going on. And in state of New York, the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is actually buildings. It's not transportation. So how do you heat buildings in New York City without gas? So you need some very, very high duty solar power plants or wind power plants. But you put wind power in Nantucket and Kennedy's and Koch's join hands to oppose it. Because they don't want their vacation to be kind of viewing the wind turbines. Even in Seattle, transportation, of course, our biggest problem, but buildings are a huge issue. Meat consumption, about 1/4. Nevis and I are doing a paper. The title is Pope or Prosciutto. We're doing a survey experiment in Italy that in response to Pope Francis' appeal, are Italians willing to consider higher meat tax, and they're not. It's very interesting, even in Italy. Even amongst Catholics, Pope Francis doesn't have an appeal on meat tax. So we are calling it Pope or Prosciutto. That's the tentative title. 25% of greenhouse gas emissions are agriculture-based. 14% are based on meat. And it is methane. Are we willing to give up meat? Are we willing to reduce meat? I don't believe in extreme policies that give up. No. Can we reduce it? If you look at the latest IPCC report, it's the richest 1% of the world people, through their lifestyle, through their yachts, through their airplanes, are accounting for a disproportionate burden of greenhouse gas emissions. In Painfield, Everett, private charters now exceed commercial airlines. Get a bit of money, you don't want to fly commercial, you want to fly private. It's really amazing. One of the boom areas now is chartered airlines. It's amazing. It is bizarre. But if you look at the Leonardo DiCaprio, the cheek the guy has to pick up his environmental price, climate price. He was in France. He flew in a private jet to New York for a few hours to pick up his climate price. And then he pontificates to all of us about climate change and moral issues. And you say, well, really? What was your climate footprint? Can you walk the talk? Al Gore got taken up for the same reason. That, are you walking the talk, or is it all hypocrisy? He sold his companies to Qatar for $100 million, which is oil money. And then in inconvenient truth, he says, well, this is a moral issue. Really? Give back your $100 million. Then we'll talk morality. So I think, there are contradictions. All of us have contradictions. And companies have to face with these contradictions day in and day out. And part of the reason is that people still want meat. If you're McDonald's, you don't have a choice. You can introduce plant-based burgers and this and that. I think Ben will correct me. Starbucks' market share of sustainable coffee, I don't think it's even 5%. At least it wasn't when I was able to see the data. They don't disclose the data. They have it, and they say we have sustainable coffee, sustainably sourced coffee. But what is the market share? How many people go to the barista and say, give me sustainable coffee? I'd be surprised if it's a very significant number, even on University of Washington campus. Similarly, cars. We say it's a climate emergency. And there's an extinction rebellion, and everybody's so angry that we're not doing anything about climate change, and people are suing the government. But ask them, okay, what are you willing to give up? It's very easy to say it's government's fault, it's this fault, it's that fault. But eventually what the companies are doing is because we want the stuff, right? If we decide to drastically reduce our driving, I'm not saying eliminate it, drastically, everybody takes a voluntary 50% cut. Oil prices will fall. It's a question of time. It's happening in some places in Europe. We have the flight share movement, and airline industry, especially for short-haul flights, is in deep, deep trouble because people have stopped taking short-haul flights. So in my scheme of things, I don't like to blame structures. I know blaming structures is in vogue these days. I think, yeah, structures are important. Structures limit choice, but eventually the buck stops with us, including the stuff about ESG and CSR in companies. Companies, at the end of the day, are responding to signals from shareholders, from consumers. Yes, companies influence our choices through advertising. Amazon is now, one click Amazon Prime has drastically changed the landscape of retailing. Malls are disappearing. Malls, which are a symbol of American capitalism, are disappearing. It is shocking. This thing has happened in my lifetime. And you understand why. And it's Amazon. It's a technology-driven lifestyle change. It's the introduction of Kindle. When it got introduced about 20 years ago, maybe, I thought this will not work. People still want to touch the paper. So the Cambridge series I did, now most of the stuff is online. People don't want to buy stuff. People don't want to buy books. Lifestyle has changed. Structure is important. Structure is, so to deny the importance of structure would be, in my opinion, being ignorant. But we still have a level of agency. So if we want firms to do stuff, the question we have to ask is, what pressure, what costs are we willing to incur to put pressure on them? Are we willing to boycott? So I don't want anybody to confess, but think of it. Last time you went to a grocery store, how many looked up the label for organics? Again, I don't want people to tell me anything. Last time you bought a piece of apparel, did you see where it was manufactured? Was it Honduras? Was it Bangladesh? Did they subscribe to any code of conduct? Did you do any due diligence? I would suspect most people did not, because I do not. And I'm an environmental guy. because I'm in a hurry. I'm used to a particular brand. I just go and do it because I have 20 other things to do. I just don't investigate. But then the companies get a free ride. And then we blame the companies. But the issue is if we don't want to invest, it's like democracy. People complain about politicians, but people don't want to invest time in a high quality political discourse. People don't even want to turn up to vote. And then they start blaming the politicians. So I see a great deal of inconsistency. If you want something, whether it's companies, whether it's government, we have to incur a cost. If something is dear to you, tell me what are you willing to give up? And companies listen to us. This whole data science stuff, what are they doing? They're trying to understand everything we do so that they can model our behavior, understand what motivates us. We are actually quite important, collectively speaking. Only if we recognize that power. So, yeah, companies are doing ESG, environmental, social, and governance, but you don't know how they are balancing one versus another. What if environmental issues require particular kind of intervention, but that's affecting or imposing costs on vulnerable communities in the area? That's the whole mining debate now. The president has declared or put 5 critical minerals, nickel, copper, manganese, lithium, one more, and a couple of others under the Defense Production Act. And he is promising expedited mining because, we need all this stuff for renewable energy. And I think we do. But a very large number of mines are within 30 miles of Native American reservations. And Native American communities have been given a raw deal for a very long time. Very long time. So do we want to repeat history, or what are we going to do? How are we going to take into account the preferences of Native American communities before we start a new lithium mine in Thacker Pass, which is going to supply about 10 to 15% of US lithium? It is a big, big project. So this is what we call procedural justice. So justice could be substantive in terms of outcomes, but in terms of process. So what are the procedural safeguards? And what if they're long drawn out? Sometimes processes take time. And on the other hand, we are seeing this climate emergency. So how do we handle the tension between procedural justice, which is time consuming, and the climate emergency? And if you're a company, what do you do? Do you invest in lithium? Because, lithium demand is going to skyrocket. If you look at the share prices already, they're off the charts. Or you would say, no, it hurts X, Y, or Z, so I will not do it. So how would that work out in ESG? You'll do well on S, but you'll not do well on E. What's the metric? How do you add up things? And that's one of the big problems with ESG, CSR. They are not recognizing contradictions. How do we add up? Who prevails and why? And it's not that we need complete agreement on everything. We don't. But the first step is to at least start acknowledging the disagreement. All this rhetoric, Larry Fink type ESG, as if the world is lovely, there are no contradictions. There are contradictions, there are trade-offs. And ignoring trade-offs does not solve problems. It only puts problem away, and then they resurface in unexpected and very malignant ways, which is not good. So I think before I shut up and ask you for questions, my only suggestion would be, as you go through this course, every time you have a speaker or you are doing reading, ask yourself, what is a trade-off? Nothing is free. Who will make this trade-off? Are we going to reproduce the existing inequalities? Because that is what is happening. LNG plants that President Biden wants to open up, essentially, it's the poor communities that are living around these plants. The horror stories in Texas and Louisiana, or the mines that are going to be opened up. It's native people and people of marginalized communities are going to pick up the tab. So where do we draw the line? Instead of saying we'll open the mines, we'll also do environmental justice. No, you can't do both. You need to have a conversation. Otherwise, one body is doing this. In fact, we are going to organize a workshop in national academies precisely on this point. One State Department is talking about national security, energy security, critical mineral supply chain, and others talking about environmental justice. They're not talking to each other. And there's a clear contradiction, even sitting in Seattle, in the other Washington, we can see that. So why can't your people sitting in Washington DC see that? How are you going to solve the contradictions? So force people to take a position on this. Because eventually the position will have to be taken. But the earlier we identify policy problems and actually have a strategy to develop a better solution. There's no perfect solution. That's again, one of the follies. People offer this perfect solution. There are better solutions. And eventually you have to arrive at a trade-off and you have to arrive at a compromise. That's what politics is about, really, in the ultimate way. That, okay, can we get a better solution? Solution that is acceptable to most, if not all, so that we at least move forward. Now we are actually moving backward in the last 2 years. It is actually shocking. With Democrats in control, our coal production is rising, our CO2 emissions are rising, and there's a lot of nervousness. When it comes to funding the green fund globally, we had promised $11 billion, and we are forking out barely $1 billion. And US wants to go around claiming climate leadership. It can't even put money where its mouth is. And I've not even talked about climate refugees because that's a completely different conversation. It's a mother of all problems. But business, ESG, CSR, climate change focuses on trade-offs and how we can move forward with better solutions. If we can do that, I think that's huge progress. Okay, let's do Q&As. Gary has threatened me that you have a lot of questions.
They do actually. So I think we'll go ahead and maybe wind up the video at this point.